I live here in Copenhagen. I live here in Copenhagen, close to a place called Triangle, which is a very enticing name. In French, I think it would be Place du Triangle. And I had a coffee before I came here, and there were some cakes on the counter, and I asked, "What are these kind of cake?" And they said they're Madeleine cakes, and I said, "Oh, really? It's like in Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu," and they didn't know what I was talking about. But I think it would be Place du Triangle, Triangle, and in English it would be for sure Triangle Square. Thank you. I was happy with that one. I was happy with that one. I wrote that Wednesday recently, and so there's a bit of ringing. It's a bit. You can still hear me. Yeah, with less ringing. Very good. And at Triangle, there's an antiquarian bookstore, and a couple of years ago, I was in this antiquarian bookstore, and I found this book here. It's a biography on Freud by the Danish writer and filmmaker Christian Brod Thomsen. And I decided to buy it. So I queued up to pay for the Freud biography, and there was one person before me in the queue who I somehow seemed to recognize from newspaper photographs. It looked like Christian Brod Thomsen. And when he had left and it was my turn to pay, I had to ask the antiquarian. And he said, yes, it was him. And he had bought one of his own books with a dedication in it. And we both agreed, the antiquarian and me, that it's a bit sad to find one of your own books in an antiquarian bookstore, especially if there's a dedication in it. Then, a bit later, in another antiquarian bookstore, I found this book. It's an autobiography by the Swedish opera singer Birgit Nilsson. And I decided to buy it because there was a dedication in it. And I thought it would be a bit sad if Birgit Nilsson would walk into this antiquarian bookstore and find her own dedicated book. Now later I found out that she was dead, so it didn't matter. But I read the book, and in the book there is a section about the opera in Parma, where they make cheese. And there was a tenor giving a concert at the opera at Parma, and in Parma, and in the Parma Opera House. And the audience in Parma is known for being very, very picky. And the tenor was booed out. And the next day at the railway station, there was a porter helping the tenor with his luggage. And the porter looked at the tenor and asked, "Aren't you the tenor who gave a concert at the opera last night?" And the tenor was a bit narcissistic, which some tenors are, and he was a bit proud at being recognized at the railway station by a porter. So he said yes. Then the porter put down the luggage and told the tenor to carry it himself. In the 70s, Birgit Nilsson, she was doing a tour in Italy, and at the end of every concert, she would sing Liebestod, which is the finale of Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. And after the concert in Parma, the audience was screaming. And Birgit thought they were booing, so she didn't go in again. Then after a while, the opera director, he rushed backstage and told her that she was wrong, that the audience didn't say boo, they said bis, which in Italian is supposed to mean again. And Birgit Nilsson finishes the story by writing, "They wanted me to let Isolde die one more time." In the opera Tristan and Isolde, in the first act, Tristan is supposed to escort Isolde to the king, because Isolde is getting married to the king, and Tristan is the king's loyal soldier. But Tristan and Isolde fall in love. In the second act, Tristan starts to feel bad about the hoochie-cooching with Isolde, and he lets himself become wounded in a sword fight. And now, towards the end of the second act, he's at home dying. Then, in the third act, Isolde arrives on a ship, like the ships from America arrived in Liverpool with rock and roll records. And Tristan and Isolde do quite a bit of singing. Then another ship arrives with the king, and the king says that everything is all right and forgiven, and that Tristan and Isolde should marry. But now Tristan is dead. Now, this is not completely unlike how my mother and father met, in great confusion in Mallorca. And there was probably some drinking and arousing Spanish music. And there were sandy beaches and a hot sun, but also the shadow of the dictatorship of General Franco. And my Dutch mother and my Swedish father didn't speak the same language, and to both of them it was the first time they'd been flying. And in all this confusion, one of them might not have been able to say no. And they got married, and 1 year and 3 days later, my mother gave birth to a son, and that was me. My father had been married before, but his wife had tragically died. They had 2 sons, Thomas, who was a teenager and who would soon move out, and Robert, who was 11, to whom I became a bit of a mascot. Robert had a tape recorder, a Philips reel-to-reel in white plastic that stood up like a transistor radio, and on the top there were 2 small reels, not much wider than coffee cups. In a school essay, Robert wrote that he got a tape recorder for Christmas from grandfather that had empty batteries. That nearly killed his Swedish teacher. It was the most sublime misuse of a pronoun he'd ever seen. Jag fick en bandspelare av farfar som hade tomma batterier. Robert was a fervent record collector, and every Saturday he would buy the latest 45s from England at Strandqvist's Musik. When his teacher asked him what he wanted to become when he grew up, Robert answered, radio. Not a radio, just radio. And he would record programs on his Philips reel-to-reel and play records and talk in between, like a DJ. And once in a while, I would be his guest in the studio. The first time my voice was caught on tape, it seems like Robert has left the studio to make a reportage. And he starts it by speaking in a reporter's voice, saying, "This is Olof Olsson, newly born." And then the microphone is held in front of me, and somehow I understand that it's my turn to speak. And I say, Winnie the Pooh. In Swedish, Nalle Puh. Winnie the Pooh over and over again, more screaming than speaking. And Robert asks questions, and every time I answer, Winnie the Pooh, screaming over and over again, like a machine gun. And the more I scream, the more Robert is slipping into the cool detachment of his reporter's voice. And from the sound of the recording, it seems like we're both enjoying ourselves a great deal. But why was I screaming Winnie the Pooh over and over again? Maybe it was a reaction to my brother's microphone behavior. If he so emphatically was the straight man, then I needed to be the freak. Or maybe I was too young to understand the concept of a microphone. Maybe my Winnie the Pooh machine gun was a reaction to the absurdity of the idea of speaking into a white piece of plastic in place of a human being. Or maybe Winnie the Pooh simply was the primary thing on my mind. Like most people who collect things, Robert is a sentimental person. My father is sentimental as well. But my mother isn't sentimental at all. And maybe it's because my mother is a Catholic. Maybe if you believe in God, you don't have the need to see spirituality in a black flat piece of plastic. It's enough with God. Between 1984 and 1990, I read The Face. Do you know The Face? Some? None. If you nod, I can't see you. It's like there's light here. Could you say yes if you know? Yes. Could you say no if you don't know? No. Okay, so it's 28%. It's sort of used to be an underground dish fashion magazine. You will understand from the context. Between 1984 and 1990, I read The Face. And through The Face, I got access to the latest English subcultural fashions, although I lived in Helsingborg. And I always treasured those old copies of The Face that were neatly piled and well kept on the bottom of the cupboard in my old room. In 2005, in December, I was going to Helsingborg to celebrate Christmas. And I was looking forward to reading those old copies of The Face. Because the 80s were once again on the radar. But my mother had thrown them out. Then, when I was in the attic to get Christmas decorations, I found a manuscript, a file of manuscripts. And without saying anything to anyone, I brought it with me back to Helsingborg. In the file, there are about 100 typewritten pages in different sizes. And the first pages I read were 2 letters, which bear the mark of many mixed feelings. And the fact that the writer doesn't know to whom he's writing. And I've tried my best to translate them from Swedish, and now I'll try to read them. Here's the first letter. To the teacher, hereby a thanks for the remarks concerning the solutions for letter number 1. It's comforting to know that one gets one's creations judged objectively. As to the spelling mistakes, the matter is that I'm not able to read what I myself have written. In this case, as in so many others, I'm thus constrained to trusting other people. But it's my hope that the number of typing mistakes will diminish as I gradually get more and more used to the typewriter. As to my all too lively imagination, that disease seems to be incurable. One had hoped that it would disappear over the years, but it doesn't look like it. Duschebro, July 19, 1951. Yours sincerely, Eugen Olsson. This is the second letter. To the teacher. Hereby, a reverent and heartfelt thanks for the friendly encouragement which accompanied the corrections for letter number 2. It arrived timely enough to keep me from despair. Certainly, I'd like to get what's written published if it could be considered worth it. But I'm completely unconversant in the ways of getting something into print. I would therefore be earnestly grateful for some advice. To whom should I suitably turn when it comes to get the story Shipwreck accepted by a newspaper? Who could one imagine would be willing to print Auerbach and Björnsson, a comparison? Is it possible to turn to more than one paper? Are there any special conditions? Can one expect any compensation for the transfer of the publication rights? Maybe I'm asking stupidly, but as I said, I'm completely unfamiliar with these circumstances. Hereby, sending the solutions to the third letter, I'm of course aware that it's not right to send about twice as much as I'm allowed to, according to the rules. But the thing is that I've hesitated and hesitated as to choose which of my creations I should send in. Thus I send in everything I've written in connection with the studies of this letter, and leave in confidence to my Mr. Teacher to choose what is worth correcting. As to the different short stories, they might demand a little explanation in order to be understood. I think my printer ran out of paper. Can I have page 15? Are you following?
Yes, of course.
Why are you not at 15? No, this is wrong. This is 19.
Oh, then, oh.
Thank you. We'll go back a bit. I should then be at 14. 14, 15. Sorry. Could I have some more water? Okay. As to the different short stories, they might demand a little explanation in order to be understood. The story Annunciation wants to depict the most brittle premonitions of a young mother facing the mystery of a new life coming into being. In the story Love and Death, which partially is based upon the dreams of a young mother closely akin to me, it wants to depict her worries facing the price she might have to pay for the right to love. The story The Wilderness Girl and the Sea Eagle depicts the relationship between an elderly man and a young woman. Finally, I'd be exceedingly grateful if letter number 4 could be sent to me immediately, so that I could occupy myself with that while I'm waiting for the corrections for the assignments of letter number 3. Dösjebro, November 7, 1951. Yours faithfully, Eugen Olsson. Now, Eugen Olsson was my grandfather, and in 1951 he was 55 years old. He had been working as a school teacher since the First World War, and he was very active in politics. Everything seems to indicate that my grandfather was a very resourceful man. He was one of those resourceful men and women that built the Swedish welfare state. And to his wife and his 2 sons, it was probably not always easy to live under the shadow of such excellent resourcefulness. To me, he was always very kind, and he took me seriously, which of course is the most beautiful gift one can give to someone who's nearly 12 years old. Each time I go through a breakup, I watch the Hitchcock movie Vertigo. And after having watched the Hitchcock movie Vertigo, I say to myself that the relationship industry is not for me. A couple of months ago, I was in an antiquarian record store looking for Sibelius. He wasn't there. I found this box of records, a recording of Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. And as you can see, I decided to buy it. Because I always liked the music in Vertigo composed by Bernard Herrmann, and people say that Bernard Herrmann supposedly was inspired by Tristan and Isolde when composing the music for Vertigo. And it came out, this recording came out in the golden age of hi-fi in 1961 on Decca. Decca. Decca used to be called. I forgot. Dulce. Dulce something. We need someone who's correcting the corrector. Shall I do it?
Yeah, maybe you're better.
It's very messy. Yeah, I know. It's written on both pages sometimes, and it's because one page started to get really messy, and then I thought I'd make it less messy. Oh yes. Okay. Dulciphone. Decca used to be called Dulciphone, but in a time of growing capitalist competition, Decca needed a better name. So they took the D from Dulciphone and combined it with Mecca. The owner, the director of the company, was a linguist and knew that Decca would be a good word in many languages, like Kodak. Although Mr. Eastman, who found Kodak, wasn't a linguist. But it was easier to get those kinds of ideas in the 19th century than in the 20th century. And in the 20th century, you need to have some sort of specialized education to get those kinds of ideas. And in the 19th century, everything was possible. And I don't know about this century here, but we'll see. It's going to be exciting. So it was called the Dulciphone, and then it was called Decca. And Decca had the best sound. Between already from the 30s, they had, the old 78s. You remember the old 78s? Even their 78s were better than the other 78s. Although it sounded bad, but they were better. And all the way until 1980, when Decca was sold to Polygram, and then they didn't have as good sound anymore. And it wasn't Polygram's fault. It was simply that their chief engineers retired. They identified with the Decca sound, and they retired. They had been working there since 1931, and they retired. Decca had the best sound. And in the Second World War, the Royal Air Force Coastal Guard couldn't hear the difference between the British submarines and the German submarines. So they turned to Decca, and Decca developed a new hydrophone, a microphone for underwater use that was much more sensitive. And Decca developed a new technology to record the submarines, extending the frequency range from 8,000 hertz to 15,000 hertz, which was an incredible improvement, since the human hearing, if you're young and you've never been to a rave or whatever kids do these days, then you can hear up to 20,000. So getting from 8 to 15, was very, was a vast improvement. And this new technology was used to record the sounds of the submarines, so that one could train the hydrophone operators to identify German submarines so that they could be bombed. But before the German submarines were bombed, the hydrophone operators had to take their headphones off. Oh yeah, it works. It's a good system. Now, in rock and roll, Decca didn't make much sound of itself apart from signing the Rolling Stones. They famously refused to sign the Beatles, saying guitar groups are on the way out. But in classical music, Decca did astounding work, and their ambition wasn't to make classical records that sounded as good as a concert. It should sound better. And even for big operas, they preferred to make studio recordings, even if it was incredibly expensive. I would like to play a record for you, but it's not a normal record. It's a recording of the recording, because when they issued Tristan and Isolde in 1961, you got the 5 records, the 4 hours of the opera, and they were so proud of what they had done that they added an extra record, like a making of, like a recording of the recording. And I'd like to play a little bit from it.
Because now what we will hear, I don't know, because the very last is not very good. I was also very nervous, and it's not very good.
Yes.
We didn't remake this again after the intermission, isn't?
Well, we have a lot to listen to. Shall we listen to the last one?
No, I think this is the worst. The previous last, when you stopped me, this I would like here. You stopped me twice, and these both I think are very good. I can be wrong, but I thought it's very good. And after the last, I didn't like it at all. But this all can be wrong, John. I don't know.
You mean starting 8 before D?
The whole. We had a whole half or 3/4. Which is this?
All right, so it is 141.
But it had worked. It had happened.
Now, this man with the clear Viennese accent is the opera's conductor, Georg Solti. Georg Solti, he through his career, he got 32 Grammy Awards. 32 Grammy Awards. That's more than anyone else in classical or pop. And some of his Wagner recordings even entered the charts. He was up there with Elvis. And still he admits that he's uncertain and nervous. And Georg Solti admits that he's uncertain and nervous because if you're an artist and you take it seriously, you can never be sure. And my grandfather in his relation to his teacher in short story writing will always remain a little boy. And his teacher can give him assignments and advice and encouragement, but he can never take away that insecurity. Now, it's always easier to explain why something happens than why something doesn't happen. But in however which way it didn't happen, my grandfather never published anything. his manuscripts stayed in this file. During the Second World War, there was a Swedish popular song called När ljusen tändas på andra sidan sundet, when the lights are lit on the other side of the sound. And it's about being on the Swedish side and looking over to the Danish side, and there would be lights because Denmark would be liberated. But on the day of the Danish liberation, my grandfather noticed that something was wrong with his eye. And first he thought that there was a hair in the way, but it was the beginning of his blindness. And in the file of manuscripts, there's one manuscript written after the correspondence course. It's dated 10 years later, 1961. And on those 15 pages, he describes the blow of becoming blind. And he's in hospital for a couple of weeks, and then he has to go home. And he comes home, and it's Saturday night, and his sons are out having fun. And his wife is tired because she had to get up early to fetch him at the hospital in the city. So she decides to go to the bedroom and have a short rest. But soon my grandfather can hear that she's sleeping. And he feels completely alone and desolate and desperate. And he thinks of killing himself. But for some kind of reason, he turns on the radio. And he sits by the loudspeaker. And on the other side, in front of the microphone, someone is doing something. Something beautiful or extraordinary or stupid enough to make my grandfather change his mind.